This is the final instalment of the video series on replacing a head on a 4D56 engine. So here we are replacing the front main crank seal. It's not essential that you do this if yours is not leaking. There was small amounts of oil leaking from mine, and while we're here it doesn't cost much to buy the seal and it doesn't take much time to do it. So ideally you'd use a seal pressing tool here or a suitable size socket to press it in evenly. Seeing as I didn't have anything that was suitable, I'm just using a hammer and punch here very lightly all around the seal circumferentially to make sure that the seal goes into the recess without going in at an angle and without tearing the seal. And make sure you lubricate the seal with oil before you do this. It shouldn't be a problem if you don't have the correct size press, so again just make sure it's seated correctly and in the right position. Next on the list we're going to refit the balance belt, so it's a new balance belt and new balance belt tensioner. Again, it's up to you to decide whether this is something that you want to replace or not replace. Some people, I believe, don't use these at all, but again it's purely up to your discretion as to whether you use this or not, but I've elected to use it. I've marked the timing points up with an orange paint marker to make them a little bit easier for you to see. So we're going to follow through the installation procedure. I'm just applying some anti-seize to the snout of the crank here, just for anyone, including myself in the future, that potentially needs to remove these parts. It's not a fun game when they're rusted on, so a bit of preventative maintenance there. It's a bit tricky to get all of the points lined up and everything tensioned correctly, but stick with it and I'm sure you'll get there in the end. The first time I tensioned this up, I actually ended up having it one tooth out on the pulley on the left, but I just needed to reseat it and retime it, and away you go. So rotate the engine over by hand and check that all of the marks are correct after one or two rotations and torque the bolts down. You can see that actually I was about one tooth off here, but subsequently corrected it and went through the same steps with the retorquing procedure. So again, I didn't need to replace my thermostats, but for the amount of money that they cost, and while you're here, you might as well just do it. But again, up to you. You don't need to spend the money if you don't want to spend the money. The housing's a little bit pitted, but with the time frame I had, which was 2 weeks to diagnose and fix this truck, I didn't have time to purchase a new housing, but it should be suitable for our needs. Again, the factory gasket here is paper or metal, but I didn't have a new gasket in my gasket set for this, so I'm using Permatex Ultra Black, which is my favourite RTV to use. Fingers crossed, should be no problem for this application. So again, with RTV, everybody has their own procedures and methods for using, but ideally you want to spread it out in a thin layer, tighten the bolts till they're about hand tight or just lightly with a ratchet, wait for about half an hour or so, or an hour, and then torque to final specifications. It's really important to make sure the head gasket sealing surface is perfectly clean and flat, so just make sure you go over it again. Again, my preferred method is a brake cleaner and a Stanley blade, but it's really important, and I've cut a lot of the footage out of me cleaning this deck surface, but take your time and go through it thoroughly to make sure the gasket seals correctly. Before the head goes on, I'm setting cylinder number 1 to TDC, as everything will be based and timed around that. putting the head on is a little bit awkward due to the size of the head and the height of the truck. But again, take your time and try and make sure you don't damage the head gasket while you're putting the head on. Would be a little bit easier with 2 people, but it is manageable on your own. I had the cam cover installed for installation, just to make sure that I didn't drop anything into the valves and cause any damage by knocking them on anything. So I'm using ARP assembly lube here to lubricate the threads of the head bolts. So the head bolt set that I had came with new bolts, but not new washers, so I'm reusing my old washers. These are the specs for the head. It's really important that you follow these very carefully and maintain the procedure from the installation sheet from your head manufacturer. So different head manufacturers will have different installation instructions, but make sure you follow those, because ultimately those are the people that you're going to be going back to if you have a problem. So the head bolts for this head need to be torqued down in 3 stages. I've saved you a lot of the videos because nobody wants to watch me torque 18 bolts in 3 stages. I had a bit of a fight with the timing belt trying to get it on. It was a little bit awkward to do and quite difficult in places, and as a result I didn't have the camera running for the full procedure, but I found this particularly awkward to get on and didn't end up following the normal procedure you would use for putting a cam belt on. I actually ended up installing the belt onto the bottom pulley, the fuel pump pulley and the cam pulley before installing the tensioner pulley. And this was the only way that I could make it work for me personally. The tensioner spring on the pulley was so strong that actually trying to compress that spring ended up bending the arm for the spring on the tensioner pulley. So I'm not sure whether I got a bad spring or a bad tensioner or something wasn't working properly, but anyway, I managed to find my own way around it, but perhaps not normally how you would fit a cam belt kit. So here reinstalling the lower cover. Cleaning the mounting face up for the coolant port on the side of the head. So I'm just using 120 grit sandpaper here. But again, you can use your own preferred method, but I found this works quite well for me. This mounting bracket for the power steering pump uses one of the bolts for the water pump for its installation. So either you can leave that bolt out when you're installing the water pump, or what I would recommend is actually you do use that bolt when you install the water pump, just to make sure that that gasket is seated correctly, and then when it becomes time to refit this bracket, that you remove that bolt, fit the bracket, put the bolt back in, and re-torque to the correct spec. The gasket for the exhaust and inlet manifold only fits one way. It looks a bit confusing because it looks like it almost fits two ways, but it only fits correctly one way, so just be careful when you're putting that gasket on. And if you think you have an error with your gasket, try fitting it in another direction, because it's very, very close to fitting one way, but actually only does fit one correct way. I'm going to save some of the footage of me putting in all of the bolts and nuts for both of the manifolds, as it's a bit tedious because there's lots of bolts, but effectively the exhaust manifold's held on with studs and nuts, and the inlet manifold is held in with bolts. So as long as you've retained those items from when you remove them, you should have no problem refitting here. here I'm refitting the turbo exhaust manifold heat shield, or turbo heat shield, and I've been going for a little while now, so we'll stick some music in so you don't get bored, and we'll keep going through the steps to reassemble this engine and this head. So here we're reinstalling the radiator fan. The standard fan uses just bolts, but the kit I received had nuts and studs, so that's my preferred method anyway. It just gives you something to rest the fan on when you're installing it. So here we're setting the clearances for the rocker arms to valves. So the spec sheet that you'll receive with the head will give you a value for hot and cold clearances. So because the engine hasn't started yet, we're going to be setting clearances to the cold value. So all you need for this is a 10mm spanner, a crosshead or Phillips screwdriver, and a feeler gauge to set them correctly. You need to check at 2 different positions with the crankshaft, so you'll be able to adjust 4 rocker arms in each position. So just make sure that you follow the instructions in the factory repair manual, or the installation instructions with your replacement head. And again, take your time going through these and make sure they're set correctly, and it probably wouldn't hurt to recheck these after a few hundred or a few thousand miles, just to make sure that they're exactly where they need to be. I'm sure someone's going to ask me. I'm using 5W30 engine oil from Shell. It's fully synthetic. Everyone has their own opinions on oil. Everyone is adamant that their choice is the best. I'm going to use this because I already have some. I needed to order a second bottle actually to fill it up. But yeah, firstly, I already have some. Secondly, I use Shell oil in all of my vehicles. It's a reasonable price. I've not had any issues with it. And as per most people, if you don't have any problems with what you're doing, why would you change? So there might be something better, there might be something worse, but for me, this is what I use, and I haven't had any issues so far with it. So make your own choice, but this is what I use. I have lost some footage. I'm not sure what happened, whether the camera ran out of memory card capacity, battery, or I didn't press the button. But you will have missed the installation of the EGR valve, which isn't too complicated. It's just a couple of bolts and hoses. The intake hose, again, not difficult, just 2 hose clips, and the radiator. So I've opted for a new radiator in this based on the fact that the head gasket did let go. There was potential there then for the radiator to be pressurised, and considering the amount of head gasket repair solution that came out of the radiator and the cost of replacing it, which was circa £60 or whatever the equivalent is in your local currency, for me it wasn't worth the risk reusing the old one, along with the fact that many of the cooling fins were crumbling away from the cooling channels. So for the cost of the replacement, it's a no-brainer to replace it. So that's been replaced. The original shroud is retained, and I've installed the upper and lower hoses. But we should be back on track now with where we are in the video. The wiring loom for the engine in this is somewhat idiot-proof. Most of the plugs only go in one position, so you don't really have a choice. But if you do get confused, have a look at the plug shape, see which ways the wires naturally want to bend, because they've been in that position for however long the vehicle was assembled. So they normally want to go back to where they were. So if you get confused, just take your time and you should be able to work it out. So in the front of the head we have a coolant temperature sensor, which should be there. But on this it's broken. It was melted and sheared off. I actually had a bit of trouble finding a replacement. I couldn't find it stocked in any generic motor factor stores, and I had to go to a Mitsubishi specialist to get that sensor. But for now, the old sensor is plugging the coolant passage in the head, but that sensor is non-functional, so it's not going to help us when we need to try and start this, because that temp sensor, I believe, feeds back to the glow plug relays. And I'm not sure what the engine thinks the temperature is when it has no sensor feedback. So I'll replace it subsequently, but for now we're going to have to manage without this sensor. Here I'm bleeding the fuel filter housing for the diesel. It's really important to try and get any airlocks out of the diesel fuel system, otherwise it will have difficulties or it will not start. So I'm just using the bleed screw and the hand pump on the filter housing here. It might be a good idea as well to bleed through to the injector lines or to the injectors from the lines, but we can do this if we're having problems or difficulties starting. As mentioned, this temperature sensor is broken and I don't have a replacement. The coolant passage is blocked in the head with the body of the old sensor, but for now we're going to have to try and manage with a broken sensor, so hopefully it doesn't cause us too many difficulties. This is one of my favourite tools for bleeding coolant in vehicles. It's effectively a universal kit with a reservoir on top of a hose. It's perfect because it creates the high point of the engine. It's the new high point, so it should all bleed out to here. It saved me a lot of time and a lot of messing around with a lot of vehicles. I'll put the link for this product in the video description. It's not essential, you can manage without it, but sometimes it can really save you a bit of time. I'm overfilling the coolant reservoir here. It's not a problem now. If the coolant system was already bled and you were filling to this level, it would probably overflow and drain out into your engine bay. But as currently the system is not bled and is full of air, it should, if it's working correctly, suck on that reservoir and pull the extra fluid into the cooling system and replace it with air as you're driving along. So if you've just reinstalled an engine and gone through the bleeding procedure, I think it's okay to overfill it and you shouldn't have any issues. Here I'm just rebleeding the fuel filter housing and cracking the lines off at the injectors to make sure that we have the fuel going from the fuel pump to the injectors and there's not air stopping the injectors popping. After cranking, check that there's fuel coming out of each injector line. That means that you're getting fuel to each injector, and we know because we've tested them that they should work correctly if there is a fuel supply with no air in it. So retighten the lines and then you can try again. So I've not cut any of these starting videos out. This is real time as we're going, and I'm just bleeding again the fuel pump filter housing just to make sure there's no airlocks. We're going to need to keep the engine running to make sure that we're getting enough coolant flow for the coolant to bleed. Of course, you can't bleed the system fully until the engine's up to temperature because the thermostat won't open. I found it particularly difficult to bleed this system on this vehicle because just sat idling the vehicle would not get hot enough to bleed. So like I said before, if you overfill the expansion tank, it should suck that fluid into the radiator and replace it with air as you go along, so it will kind of self-bleed from that tank. So perfect, thanks for joining me. I hope this has helped you with your Pajero L200, anything else using this engine. Thanks for watching.